Okay. Welcome back to Mapping the Divine. I'm Ria Wilson, and today I'm joined by Professor Brian Stiltner. Professor Stiltner is an ethicist at Sacred Heart University whose work focuses on the common good, peace building, and the role of churches in public life. Professor Stiltner's forthcoming book, Faith and Community Practices That Strengthen Churches and Neighborhoods, argues that churches have a crucial part to play in responding to what he calls the crisis of community in America, the erosion of social connection, trust, and shared purpose that is only deepened through the COVID-19 pandemic, political polarization, and rising loneliness. Drawing on 5 years of research in several Christian congregations, his book explores how ordinary church practices can build community inside congregations and in the neighborhoods around them. In today's conversation, we'll talk about the loneliness epidemic, the decline of trust in institutions, why congregations still matter for civic life, and how churches can become better community builders. I'm so thrilled to have you on the show. Professor Steltner, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Ria. It's great to be here.
Okay, I'd love to start with what drew you first towards the study of not only Christian ethics and moral theology, but also ministry at Yale.
hmm So I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, Cleveland and Columbus, Ohio, and I had a pretty standard post-Vatican II 1970s Catholic upbringing. I went to church. I went to Catholic schools from age second or third grade on, and um, and I think that was a good era. There was like a lot of like some of the heaviness that my parents and grandparents had gone through of a very strict Catholicism was kind of like the pendulum had really swung the other way. And so I just had like a p positive experience of religion as part of my life. But I think that my going to high school, which was a Catholic high school, um, and it was a all boys high school, which like was very common, before the 1960s, and those institutions are still around. And um, but that was kind of a nice thing, just kind of really getting close to like fellow guy friends and in those awkward teenage stage, not worrying about the confounding influence of, at least during the school day, of like the other of romance and things like that. But what was really important about high school was that we like studied religion like all 4 years, and those I think that kind of started to get like an intellectual curiosity. And especially toward the end there of high school, I was just beginning to find issues of like politics and ethics and things interesting coming from different directions from, your social studies courses. But we studied ethics and social justice in the last couple of years of high school. And so I went off to college. I went to John Carroll University in Cleveland, and those things kind of continue to kind of coalesce for me with like kind of being able to find peers and friends who were interested in kind of talking about these ideas in whatever kind of natural way young people do, getting involved in campus ministry, getting involved in volunteerism, and having to, and being able to, sort of being part of our schedule. At least you took a couple religion classes early on, and I continue to find studying ethics and social issues really interesting to me. And so I kind of was feeling by about sophomore year in college that like, well, maybe I'd like to major in religion. Maybe I'd like to be a college teacher. And I basically did do that. So, there was impactful professors and courses for me starting, from that time. So my religious studies professors at John Carroll University were important mentors to me. And sort of by the end of college, I was thinking about further studies, I um, and nowadays, it's like it can be very hard to go on for a PhD. Not hard, people are up for it, but it's like the academic field for employment has changed a lot from when I was younger. It's so, I didn't think that this was an easy road, but I wasn't fearful that there would like be no job. So, but kind of boldly, naively, I kind of went off. But anyhow, I had the good kind of like in between thing of like I wasn't, able or ready to kind of go right into grad doctoral studies. So I applied to a lot of master's programs and ended up at Yale Divinity School in New Haven, Connecticut. I live not far from there. I sort of like after coming to Connecticut, I didn't really move away from that area from New England in the rest of my adult life. And that was a great environment and also shaped my intellectual journey because It was so I always was, and I didn't really ever doubt too much staying on a more academic path. But I was with a lot of people who were practitioners, so I didn't know that I was looking for that as much as I was. But like being in a kind of an ecumenical, so like I had this all this Catholic formation, but there was Presbyterians and Episcopal and everything, kind of the whole spectrum of Christianity, and even kind of even here and there some like non-Christian folks came to because they just wanted to kind of like explore religion, or there's like a lot, we have good programs there at Yale Divinity School or YDS in things like Hebrew Bible studies and second Temple Judaism and things like that. So people would come for those academic programs from a lot of perspectives. But I was basically with like a lot of people that were studying to kind of go into Christian ministry. And a lot of my Catholic friends were kind of thinking about things like campus ministry and chaplaincy. So um, even though I didn't sort of like take a lot of practical classes, I wasn't kind of on the track like preaching or pastoral care. I was just in that environment where my study of theology and Christian ethics was in a community that was really thinking about what's the relevance of this in people's lives and in communities. So that was really helpful for me. And then I kind of knew by the end of that 2 years, or that I did want to continue on, and I ended up kind of getting accepted to study Christian ethics at Yale University. So I was able to stay at Yale and keep working with some of the same professors I had developed a relationship with, and started to develop the expertises and interests that have led me to that I, in one way or another, have done throughout my career as a teacher and a researcher.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. Um, I'm really interested in kind of the aspect of community, as you kind of mentioned. In your work, were there any particular experiences of community, or maybe like the lack of it, that shaped your interests and that part of your work?
Yeah, I think so, right. A theme of community and a closely related concept of the common good, which I'm sure we'll talk about some more, and that's what I did my thesis on, seemed to kind of really grab me from, I think, the beginning of my master's studies at Yale Divinity School. And I think we all obviously, or I don't know, obviously, but I do think all human beings need and want community. Um, it can take many different shapes, and that doesn't mean, and I thought when I have championed community so much, and some of my friends who are a little bit more introverted and homebodies and things like that remind me, you don't have to be so, it's not about being hypersocial, which we all agree, but we all need community in our own way, and we also need the balance of outwardness and solitude and privacy. And then the difference between extrovert and introvert is just some people kind of like strike their balance or spend more of their time on one side or other of that spectrum. So, and it's true that like you can be motivated by both seeing the positives of community and also by the lack of community and motivated that, wow, that's a something I want to address. I feel fortunate in my own life, like community has always been a positive. I mean, some communities, and right, communities are everything from your job to your family and stuff like that. Doesn't mean communities are without struggle. So I have struggles with different kinds of communities, but community of all those types has always been kind of present in my life and something I've sought in a positive. So my kind of interest, I think, kind of comes from like wanting to share that with others and help us all to have like healthier and better communities. But certainly there's no lack of like looking around the world near and far where you can see like problems of lack of community from loneliness and people not being able to cooperate or help each other out and all that kind of thing. Um, in my studies, there was when I started at Yale Divinity School, one professor in Christian ethics was um, was really into kind of questions of what's the role of religion in a pluralistic society, what's the contributions of Christianity and religious thought to democracy and a kind of a liberal free society. So that political philosophy stuff really interested me, and it was kind of through him that I got Richard Fern is his name, that I got exposed to the thinker that I like used in my dissertation Jacques Maritain. So he's a Catholic mid 20th century philosopher who wrote about those questions. So um, that was one teacher and one particular thinker that kind of was helped me kind of integrate a lot of things I was interested in, from kind of Catholic social ethics to political philosophy to applied questions of community.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. So we're kind of talking about weaving together theology and political thought and sociology. So how does this interdisciplinary approach shape the way that you thought and think about congregations and public life?
Yeah. Um, well, yeah, one thing I think about studying in my field um, in ethics as it was kind of set up, I think in both um, especially my graduate, my PhD program, we had to have some balance in our studies and the exams that we took of theological ethics. So ethics, out of the Christian tradition, primarily. So what are these? What are beliefs about God, about human nature, and things like that play into what our ethical responsibilities are? Philosophical ethics, we have sort of like know the dialogue with uh, Kantian ethics and utilitarianism and virtue ethics and all that kind of stuff, and social ethics, applying ethics in the world. So, and then among my colleagues and friends, some people, we all kind of had to be balanced in that regard or know all those kind of three poles. And then our own particular, specialties and interests. Some people worked in more theological ways, some worked in more philosophical ways, some did a dissertation project in a much more like applied question, like, reproductive technologies or something like that. And so there was interdisciplinary built into that, and ethics is kind of I mean all fields have at their best, I think, some connections to and sort of openings to kind of you can be deep in that area, but you need to kind of know how to connect to other disciplines, and we're all challenged by like looking at things from outside through dialogue and collaboration and but ethics kind of builds that in almost inherently, and I think those kind of three poles were part of that. And I think as it got into like for me as a religious studies scholar doing this too, um and it was something I only like began to learn at divinity school, but I've kind of like both learned on the fly through the years as well as learned from kind of real life people, like knowing people and ministers of other religions and doing my own kinds of collaboration. So the roles of like interreligious dialogue and cooperation and what we can learn from, kind of the parallel, but with unique twists, approaches to community and different religious traditions has been a another part of that journey. So anyhow, I do think ethics in general, as well as the study of community, has definitely is helped by a very interdisciplinary approach. And I think like in the book I've written on, well, we'll talk about a little bit of that more in the moment, but it's kind of bringing together sociology and theology and ethics and things like that together for multiple angles on community.
Yeah, and one of those angles you mentioned was the crisis of community. Can you
Mhm.
tell us a little bit more about what that means and in the scope of your studies as well?
Sure. Um, I think when I going all the way back to when I was sort of thinking about doing my my graduate work and my what would become my dissertation on the topic of the common good, you know, um, I was uh, thinking of one of the issues, that concerned me, and it was influenced by that professor I was mentioning a few moments ago. What's the role of religion in a pluralistic liberal society? How do we sort of people come from different perspectives, religious, non-religious, and we disagree over things like abortion, assisted suicide, war, or particular, military engagement. And how do we have those conversations and kind of and connect in some way in two levels, both one that we come from different perspectives and we're not going to kind of agree on those basic perspectives, but can we learn from those as they come together and not just kind of say we don't agree or we can't talk. And also how do we actually like do it civilly and not fight. I think at the time, not that people haven't always kind of fought in various ways over these things, but so a couple decades ago, I was more struck to I just be like, oh, how do we talk and how do we kind of actually how do you sort of be yourself? Like, okay, I'm a Christian pacifist, and so therefore I think that like this war in Iraq is immoral and whatever. And this someone else is like, well, my perspective is this, And can we sort of like reason together and maybe get to some better clarity about a good way to approach what I think has happened kind of like with our political culture in the past decade to two has been an increasing amount of like not only is like it hard to have that conceptual conversation or just a productive conversation, but it's like it's immediately antagonistic and or that people are in their media bubbles and their political bubbles and not talking to people at all. So the challenge of community and in on issues that are important to work out for public life and that we disagree about is always hard, but it's just been made harder. We can't even get the conversation going. So I've always had an interesting conversation. A lot of my work over the years, and including doing some things about interreligious dialogue, has been about the importance of conversations, and that shows up in my book as well. I talk about congregations as places where we could have civil, constructive, difficult conversations. And you alluded before. I mean, I think when I think about all the things that make community hard, one is understanding and working together, and another is there's and another is kind of like which the Surgeon General of the previous administration emphasized a lot, and I kind of start my book by talking about Surgeon General Murthy's report on our loneliness epidemic. There's just a practical thing that some people are kind of cut off and lonely, and then the third, and that there's been some evidence of a kind of a rise of that, and then in recent years, and then finally that our institutions like uh, churches being one, um, are places maybe that are less there to connect us in a couple different ways. One is sometimes, and this is playing out with churches and some kinds of churches in some areas, just closing or not being there. So like something that used to bring people to, together. And or another might be that and another facet that's a problem is that they can also be subject to the same forces I was talking about at the beginning of this answer, that they are just a group of like-minded people that aren't really building community among diverse people within them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Kind of going off what you talk about um Dr. Murthy's words, what are some of the deeper causes of this crisis? Can you expand on things that you mentioned, like economic inequality, partisan media, and social media, um, and what they do to our ability to act together as a common good or for the common good?
Yeah. Um, so he was um, kind of as the Surgeon General from a public health point of view was kind of saying when people are, and it can be all kinds of folks, but I think there are some kinds of social locations and conditions that make um, loneliness a little more possible. And actually, almost every kind of age group or demographic is affected in different ways. But just to think of a couple that kind of come through, and these are very commonsensical, but um, one would be the elderly, right? If you're kind of more, maybe you're widowed, your adult children have kind of, they moved out of state. You've got um you can get kind of lonely and isolated. Some of that is like, and all the solutions to these, like that's like that kind of level of loneliness is not something that public policy can fix, but just the fact of like, what if your kids had to move out of state because there's no jobs, because like you know, y- this is an elderly person who raised their kids in Connecticut or in New England, but all the jobs are kind of more in the South and the West. Um, and so there's a tendency for people to be more far flung, is just one sort of small part of the kind of things that kind of lead to these trends. Um, and there's also aspects of like making sure that people kind of like, have all their healthcare needs covered is therefore really important, so that you can actually you physically, get out and go for a walk in your neighborhood and meet your neighbors or go to church and not be homebound. We call upon our institutions like churches and neighbors and all kinds of civic associations to be aware of the people that are like a little bit lonely and disconnected in their midst, and to go and help connect. And that's one way that like churches and many other kinds of organizations like that are so wonderful. They do that kind of very um ordinary daily connecting and helping people be a little less lonely. Um, even working people, with families and stuff in the midst of like life, and you think sometimes they seem so busy, but they can be lonely in a different way because they're so busy working, and they're having a struggle of kind of like having enough community maybe in their marriage because they're both busy with jobs and kids and things like that. So again, there's aspects there where there's a human level where they just as individuals they need to kind of like be aware of that, work on their taking time, communication, making sure that they do what they can as a couple, but it's not it's also should be part of our awareness conversation of like we have an economy where people always feel that we need to have both partners in a marriage working full time, um, and yet also people want to, and both women and men, husbands and wives should have careers. So these are, complicated things, and that means there's like sort of not one answer to them, but one perspective I think that Dr. Murthy was calling for was like for us on our individual levels to be aware of this. Like, so if I'm just a human being or just a member of a church, like how am I kind of thinking about who might be lonely or disconnected that I could help in my area? And it's relevant for public policy to be thinking about how do choices that we make about economy, jobs, social services kind of help people have the time and life balance and the connectivity they need. Things around um, physical public planning, urban planning are kind of really important to kind of help make more, connectivity in neighborhoods. And, you know, that's like kind of one kind of not a field I know a lot about, but I know someone who works in that kind of field. And, I feel like from in the 1960s when we kind of were aware that some urban planning decisions were like really badly done in retrospect, that we put a huge highway all the way through and broke up this neighborhood because, well, everyone's in cars and they want to be able to get there. And now, the thinking is much more, how do we calm traffic? How do we give people walkable spaces and things like that? So, what would it mean to take that kind of, what urban planners and public policy people work in traffic and things like that do, which doesn't seem very controversial. No one thinks it's controversial to think about how do we calm traffic and how do we like make our neighborhoods more green and walkable. But that same kind of professional mentality, take it to every sector of our society. And that's, one practical thing that Dr. Murthy was calling for. Like every kind of profession from healthcare on can think about how building community can be a, a question that they're asking.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. But what was you I want to transition a little bit more to like your work
Yeah,
for the book. And the 5 years you spent studying congregations in different regions and traditions. What did you pick up? Like what part of this necessity did you pick up? And can you describe like that project and what you were looking for?
sure. So, um, yeah, every time we go on from a question, I think like, oh, there's so many more things I should have said. Um, um, and I think maybe it might help transition me into this just of because in that last question I was thinking about some different age groups and walks of
Yeah.
life. So elderly families, um, young kids, they very much crave and need, you know, connection and play. So again, we have schools and preschool programs and things like that that kind of help with that. Churches are also like amazing places where there's like a lot of my kids went to church based, sliding scale income nursery schools that were like so wonderful for their early formation. Um, but again, with intersections, what's the neighborhood like? Does it have playgrounds? Um, is there kind of affordable daycare and preschool in the area? And what do working parents have to do, all that kind of stuff. So I feel like in all these slices of and then finally the crisis of community, as I think it, taking my cues from Dr. Murthy and others, were like, and also we kind of pour things like media and screen time as it's a good and bad, like all things are, but as a isolating factor in a lot of teens, and how in the pandemic was exacerbated with that. We got kind of very kind of in our bedrooms and in our screens, and that's always a kind of a thing we're kind of fighting against to make sure that we kind of like have real face-to-face human community, and then the way that media and screens are also vectors for polarized, media that also add to the kind of this political division. So the crisis of community, which is really many, many crises coming together, is all those factors coming together. So it seems kind of overwhelming, right? And one, I mean, I'd love when anyone love, but I, have lived long enough to know that there's like no sort of like one answer or one magic wand or whatever like that. And and really community building is actually, it's not just the goal, but it's the process. Like getting together with your neighbors and having a block party is not like, oh, good, we did community and we achieved that. We checked that off the list. It's like planning that, doing it, saying, okay, let's like do it again next fall, or let's like something else that flows out of it. It's all the ongoing being of community that is the goal. So anyhow, and if everyone has their part to play, I was, interested in how, like, I think one very important civic organization institution is our churches. They have their place in this puzzle as as places that, care a lot about it, have some high-minded ideals, that we're all one human family, that we to love our brothers and sisters. Um, and they also have a strong, history and cultural role in the US. And then, again, I mean, I think these things could kind of apply to other countries and religions and worlds, but like just for my own focus on my project and and just for what I could even handle as complex as it is, I'm gonna in my book and just as I continue to talk here, just kind of thinking basically about like Christian congregations in the United States. Um, so Christian congregations and all houses of worship have been really important parts of the civic fabric of the U.S. for the past 300 years. They are, and it is changing, which is part of it for religion, which is a part of interesting change. There's fewer people going to church. There's some churches that are closing. There's other churches that are growing, but it's definitely different from, say, 50 years ago, where it's just kind of like whatever churches were just in the center of the town, everyone just kind of like went to one or the other of them. They all kind of, and a lot of their social life was organized through them. Now they're sort of like one option among many. And, but they played that connecting role. And then they do a lot of very important social service. So they really kind of help people on all those kind of social needs, like when I was running through with my examples. So, so I think, yeah, so like, okay, churches do a lot of good work and they're under some pressure. So what's it look like? What does it look like for them? What are they doing well? What are they finding to be difficult? What could I maybe suggest as a few kinds of, as some best practices or encouragements to do more of that? And so, that was just kind of the big level at which I was came at what I wanted to do. And then why I did it the particular way I did it. I was inspired by in my field by what I saw other colleagues doing, other and learning at conferences and about um, a, a kind of work that was different from the work I had done. I'm more of a book person, and so theology, ethics often is kind of like um, book oriented. So like, what did so and so say, and how does that apply? And taking kind of cues from interdisciplinary things that we can learn, as we said before. The sociology of religion as a field within religious studies has always been aware of more like, let's like find out what people are actually doing and thinking. And we can do that in two ways, and we use both, but some people expert in one or the other. Do surveys and kind of like look at, and therefore you can kind of like say what's going on with like a large group. What do American Christians in general think about this, or blah blah blah. And you can also do it very fine grained qualitatively, and you can like look at an individual person or a small group of people or a couple um, communities, church communities, and examine how they do and live and think about and talk about community. And so that approach, which is uh, or, which can go by some different names, qualitative research, ethnography, or field work, has always been around in sociology and sociology related fields like sociology, religion, but it has in the past couple of decades been something that's been a more embraced or method among all the kinds of work that people do in theology proper and in ethics and Christian ethics proper. So I was beginning, to kind of notice about a dozen years ago, uh, uh, presentations at conferences and writings of people doing an ethnography of something ethical. And I thought that sounds like really interesting. I've always kind of been, or and I always kind of worry that like there's value, but it could be also missing something just to be like, what does the book say as applied to life? Like, what does life say as applied to our books? And also, I thought that would just be also a fun to be honest, because partly because I am a social and community person, and I've also done plenty of the other kinds of writing that to take on a more kind of like risky in the sense of like I didn't know how I was going to develop or how I was going to go, and I wasn't as much of an expert or trained in it. Um, but to take on a project where I would study two or three or four or five churches and bring this question of like um, what does community building look like as they do it and take it from there.
Wow, yeah, that definitely does seem very interesting and new as opposed to, the traditional um, theology and philosophy route, especially, ones that I myself, as someone who has dabbled in that, am used to. But one other thing that I was really interested about in your writing and your work is your focus on and your argument that churches don't only exist for their own members, but also for their neighbors and the wider civic community.
Yes.
How did you see that in your work, and how that play out in the congregations you studied, and also how did that reshape how congregations, or how do you think that that should reshape how congregations should think about their mission?
Yes. Yeah, one of my a quote that I use to kind of kick off the book and come back to it at the very end is a famous quote from Archbishop William Temple, who was like an Anglican bishop in the late 1800s in England. And the line goes, "The church is the one organization that exists primarily for the people still outside it." And that does, I mean, that maybe um, captures the whole thing in one sentence. So I think it's pretty brilliant. Um, and for me, then I think a lot of what I kind of saw and kind of recommend is a sense of balance. And I structured my book, and it was my sense going in, and I think it was more or less confirmed by all that I learned that obviously one part of community and one part what a church community would be a strong internal tightly bonded community, and a lot of what we're looking for in community and what would give us kind of joy and flourishing from community is that closeness of the tight-knit community. And yet I think any community also needs to be outward and kind of connect with others and help contribute to a wider community. And actually, so I think whether a school, a business, a family, they all have like outward things. Anything that is only insular and tightly bound is either at worst it's just missing something, and at best it's just missing something, and at worst it's too insular and gets corrupted somehow by being too um, inwardly turned. The dynamic of love, as I learned in all my studies in Christian ethics, is to turn outward. Um, and then but churches as well have this mission. They have this mission to serve kind of a religious and an ethical mission, right? So both Jesus saying, "Go therefore and baptize all nations in my name." So it's like take the message out, and also the mission of serve your neighbor, love your neighbor as yourself, take care of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. Um, the stranger that and that's that triad and that kind of ethical summary of a lot of like the Hebrew Bible, Jewish Old Testament law is taking care of everyone in the community, but always with awareness of like the people who aren't part, the wayfaring stranger, the immigrant, the refugee. Strong, always a strong reminder that you were once, slaves and refugees in the land of Egypt, and I took care of you. Now you have to take care of those who are outside your community. So there's strong kind of Jewish and Christian roots in this kind of concept of community, as much as it's good to be like really um, uh, tightly connected inside, the dynamism is to kind of reach out, not perhaps to kind of invite others in religiously, like, hey, join our church, but also to serve no matter what, and without regard to um, whether the person is Christian or is going to be in your church. Um, and so I almost forgot where this question started, but but I think that, so maybe I should let you like help me reframe, or we'll take it on from there. But anyhow, that was both my inspiration for almost kind of like my hypothesis. My hypothesis is it best if or would be best um, if there's a balance of internal external community building, and actually that they probably even sort of like influence each other, or there are kind of a positive dynamic that you're in a sense, and this is the strongest version of it, you're if your church is reaching out, you actually be a stronger internal church. I think that's true. It's like, I mean, I can't really say for sure, partly because like it's hard to find a church that doesn't reach out in some way. But I feel like there's a lot that I saw in what I studied, that churches that are in a flow of that have a balance of looking inward and looking outward, and make sure that they are following what Archbishop Temple said of their mission to those who are still outside, does kind of practically make them strong, hopeful communities, and it also does live. It's the best job of living up to what their mission is supposed to be.
No, yeah, I think you definitely did. You answered my question
Yeah.
perfectly. Um, but I did kind of have a follow-up to that question, being like for listeners or readers of your book who may not be religious or who are spiritual but not religious,
Yeah.
what can they learn from your work? Which kind of builds off what you just answered, but I was wondering if you can maybe expand a little bit on that.
Yeah. Um, I I think there's a lot to learn and take away, um again, I think this quest for community. I mean, and everyone I talk to, friends and people, and they're all of different and non-religions. Everyone I'm going to mention the project I was working on is very excited as you were, which am thrilled about. But like they intuitively get like, oh, that's really needed. Like, yeah, community is like we recognize it's under a lot of pressure, and we feel worried and sad about that. So that's a good sign in and of itself. Um, people I I also know, and or it's an important part of this thing of like, if churches are like important to like the civic fabric and community building and all that kind of stuff, and they do a lot of great social service, but institutional religion has done a lot to harm people, turn people away, and all kinds of, various versions and some versions of it. I mean, the two that always weigh in people's minds of like that would come up, I think, if you kind of like get into that level of conversation, or if you kind of like maybe read sort of online comments on a news article, and if for those who are kind of have animus with institutional religion, um, you know, two of the biggest things were kind of like the Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandal and cover-ups and things like that, even though it's done all of its work to try to kind of like turn the page and be better, be more protective. Those that pain, it stays with us and with society for a long time. And also, any times that still like little things creep up of a new case, or a case that was we discovered was still like not really brought to light, it rightly makes people so angry and upset, whether they're Catholic or not, all over again. So that, and then kind of all the, which gets into a very controversial area, but all the kind of like um unhealthy politicization of religion, and in general the way that a lot of religions have uh, uh, I'm trying to think of my words, right? Because all religions, I if I'm like, I personally might have no problem like, hey, a Jewish congregation that kind of like, is concerned about climate change and is maybe doing some kind of project, but also like encouraging people to write to their senators about climate change. That's religion being political or getting involved in kind of politics in a way that I might like. And so then if I'm like, well, an evangelical Christian church that is being very pro President Trump and is advocating for its members to, tell their representatives that there should be no funding for trans care for minors. I might not like that and think that's like an abuse of religion, but I do have to, and I tried to kind of in this, this project to kind of stand back and understand that people come at these from different ways and less to try to kind of solve that one or the other version of that is right, but more like going back to what I said before, how do people with those two different perspectives kind of like learn from each other and maybe, try to kind of understand where each other's coming from. But that's kind of a sidebar from saying that there's been a lot of kind of, naked partisanship in religion. I think especially, I think it is fair to say, like more heavily in recent years of like kind of the conservative side of American Christianity toward, the current kind of MAGA movement. And obviously that makes people think like, why should we, why should I be interested in religion as a community builder when it gets so involved in a divisive politics? So So therefore, I can understand why the non-religious or spiritual but not religious people are turned off. The reasons that some of them are non-religious uh, or some version of none, if especially if they were raised religious and moved away, is can be influenced in part by some of those reasons. So religion's still always going to be a social force, and also um and I um and so it so there's a lot of so I think in kind of trying to tell the story, I want to tell a story, and one of my churches that I follow was an evangelical church, which I think is a much more typical evangelical church. I mean, it's more of its members and more of its pastoral leaders are a little bit more on the conservative side of things socially and theologically, but they're not doing any of that unhealthy politicization stuff. And we see the loudest, most extreme voices because of media and think that kind of typifies all of religion. So my six churches, which ran from Catholic to Black Baptist to evangelical to mainline Protestant, um, uh, are kind of a fairly average slice of churches, and I think all of them are pretty healthy communities, uh, and aware that they want to be welcoming and that they want to learn and engage with people who think differently from them, and that's a good sign. So, partly part of my message for like kind of the wider reading public would be um, there's things to have hopefulness for in the religious landscape, and be aware that our legitimate criticisms of institutional religion don't, apply across the board. Um, and I think also just the possibly kind of the model of especially for like thinking the area of kind of like spiritual but not religious, like people who kind of like have some understanding and respect for what religion has been, but are like a little bit where just not motivated or moved by the particular form that church takes. They still are. Then the kind of message would be like, but the church doesn't have to be one form, and I think both churches can learn from this and innovate in kind of what they do, and also that people can seek other things that kind of get at some of those same things in community. So um, it's if it's kind of like joining a meditation group or getting involved in a social civic activity, um, all the good things that you're seeking for yourself and for society can be better when we're kind of brought together with other people. So that's why a thing that I like and I kind of tell people about and show students I would recommend as something for any listener to follow up on. And it's easy to do at the current moment because it's on Netflix. But there's a documentary called Join or Die, and it is a 90-minute documentary profiling the work and spinning off of the work of Harvard political scientist. retired political scientist Robert Putnam, and Putnam wrote a book in 2000 came out called Bowling Alone. And so he was an influential thinker for me, and his question he was raising about the crisis of community was one that really grabbed me. And so in this book and even other things, I usually come back to Putnam at some part of it. And so Putnam was really talking about all this kind of thing of like how Elks clubs and churches and bowling leagues and things like that are all kind of down from the 1960s in terms of engagement, and people are more kind of doing online and small group friend engagements or other things like that, and wondering what's kind of lost when some of those classic civic organizations are not as strong and member oriented as they once were. So um, the documentary kind of does that and talks to profiles like all the unique forms that community can and does take. And so the kind of like the big message is like we really do need community. And if you can't find and challenge yourself to like get involved in communities, and if you don't find one that's exactly to your liking, make one or just and it doesn't have to be big and formal. And even one expression of community at that level is just like neighborliness, right? You can just kind of like you could I used the example of a block party somewhere earlier in this conversation. I mean, you could do everything from join like your neighborhood civic association that formally organizes things if one exists, or you can just get together with your five neighbors and say, hey, let's have like a 4th of July party and let's invite the rest of the block. I've seen that kind of thing happen in my neighborhood. And one of the few community things that like around me that I had nothing to do with. I just other people did it. I was like, great. I came and enjoyed it and met people that I didn't know and made connections um and then is like one kind of like community I live in that helps make my day-to-day exploration of community so much better. We notice when someone doesn't take their trash can out, and I'll take the neighbor's trash can out, or they'll take mine back in, and think all that kind of stuff like that. The idea of like connecting with community is like it has all these spill-on effects to your life, and they're so subtle, but they're so important.
Yes. I definitely agree. And thank you so much. That was a very powerful and important note to end on. And with that, just thank you, Professor Stiltner, so much for this conversation. Your insights into the crisis of community, the role of congregations, and the everyday practices that build trust and belonging have offered a very powerful vision of how churches can serve both their members and their neighbors, and as well gives hope that congregations can still play a vital role in renewing civic life. I'm so grateful for the clarity and the depth you brought to these topics and to our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us on Mapping the Divine.
Thank you.
If today's episode sparked your curiosity about Christian ethics, the common good, or congregational life, I encourage everyone to look for the ways communities around you, as Professor Stiltner mentioned, are already building connections, and to imagine what might be possible if churches leaned even more fully into that calling. Professor Stiltner, thank you once again for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.